Well, hey, and welcome to my very first episode of Proof Theology. I'm calling it episode 0 because it's kind of an introductory episode. And I've got my friend Matt here with me, and he's going to be contributing in this show as well. Really, the goal of Proof Theology is this, that we want to explore strong theological topics from Christian intellectuals to help us navigate really cultural times and utilize Christian scholarship. I was talking to a professor a couple weeks ago, and really, I view the people in the academy not as adversaries, but as allies in our kind of advancement of the gospel. And they're almost like artillery, where I'm serving kind of on the front lines of ministry as a pastor of a church with Matt, and I need some help from scholarship from the academy. And so, what I want to do in this podcast is basically have conversations with these scholars and with these intellectuals that I'm already having on the phone, and I just want to kind of let you in on those conversations as well. I'm really excited to hear from Matt today. We're going to hear about his study of patristics and his experience in seminary. And you're going to be able to ask questions as we go along. Those questions will pop up for me, and so I'll be able to see them on the side. So if you've got any questions for me or Matt as we talk, go ahead and ask those, and go ahead and share this with anyone you think might benefit from thinking more deeply about our Christian faith and how we can share the gospel more richly and truly through intellectual scholarship. And for me, this podcast has been really a long time coming. I've wanted to do something like this for a while. I feel like I've been entrusted with a lot in terms of relationships, and people have invested in me. And so this is kind of my way to steward what God has given me in a way that hopefully is helpful. You know, I'm having conversations with coaches, mentors, theologians, and a lot of times these conversations take the current cultural conversation to a deeper place than social media or the news will. And so what I want to do is I want to pull from church history and look at how the church has historically dealt with contentious issues or difficult issues. And I really hope that can help us and inform how we live in our lives today. Think of this conversation as like if you ever went to a pub or a bar with your professor after class and you kind of got the real deal, kind of their more unfiltered comments. That's what this podcast is going to be. So yeah, we're going to have podcasts with interviews with basically intellectuals who kind of fly under the radar, and at least in my estimation, they're not well known, they're not big names, and it's kind of I love the opportunity to promote other people, to celebrate what other people are doing, and so that's what we're going to be doing. The name Foolproof, just to kind of give you the rundown on that, since it is the first kind of episode, the name Foolproof has a kind of a double meaning. First, I enjoy bourbon. I know Matt does too.
It's true.
And with bourbon, what you can get oftentimes is you can get a cut of bourbon that is called foolproof, and it's not cut, meaning it's not watered down. Oftentimes when they barrel the bourbon and then bottle it, what they do is they dilute it so that you and I can enjoy it if you choose to enjoy it. You can enjoy it easier if it's a little watered down. And so the idea is they'll have bottles sometimes that are foolproof, meaning full strength. And what I want to bring to the conversation in our world through this podcast is what I would call foolproof theology. This theology that's not uncut, not watered down. It's not designed to get clicks or likes. It's designed to really share the depths of Christian theology and thinking in history. Then second, of course, it's a play off the concept of foolproof, meaning something that's not easily twisted into foolish thinking. And it doesn't have a lot of foolishness to it. And so what I want to help us do as people is think deeply and not be fools. I mean, this is all throughout the Bible. We want to be wise people. And so this is an attempt to do that through engaging in deep Christian thought. Well, that's kind of the introduction so far, but I wanted to introduce you to my friend Matt. Matt's my co-pastor, co-laborer in ministry at The Well in Boulder. We planted The Well together. He's married to his wife, Ari. They have 3 kids, wonderful kids. And 2 dogs at this point, which is great. And I wanted to invite my friend Matt on the show because he's had a really interesting experience in theological education in seminary. It's not something I don't think Matt ever thought would be for him. And that's part of the reason I wanted to bring him on this first episode is as someone who really didn't think the seminary path was for him, he chose to go on it anyways. And so we're going to learn more about that as we go. So Matt, welcome to the episode today.
It's good to be on with my friend, and also view our relationship kind of like we're an old married couple. So this should be interesting.
It should. Yeah. Hopefully we won't have too many inside jokes.
Yeah. And if If you know, then you know, and if you don't, then you don't.
then you're out. Um, well, what I wanted to start with you on is, for you, we've talked about this a lot as far as your journey in college or seminary.
Hmm.
You became a pastor early on. Some could say too early in terms of age and maturity, but it was the Lord's path for you at the time, and God's been good to you in that. But a lot of people go to seminary in order to become a pastor, in order to get a job in ministry, and yet you already had the job, and so it's kind of counterintuitive for you to do something that seems backwards. So I wanted to
Hmm.
ask you, why, what made you choose to go? Like, what inspired you to go to seminary? Why were you interested in doing that?
Yeah, I think you're right on in saying I never really imagined that I would go to seminary. I really didn't have a deep desire to do it early on because, like you said, I became a pastor in a church when I was 22. I was still a senior in college and my undergrad. And I think mainly for me, one of the biggest things was it seemed scary to me because I'm not a
Mm,
great student in the classical kind of education format. I went to a school intentionally and picked a degree intentionally that did not have a lot of let's just say in classroom education. It was more in the field doing that kind of thing. So
right.
the idea of me hunkering down in a library, I knew would be a big struggle for me, and it was hard for me. I'm not great at that. I also have a, bit of a minor learning disability that makes doing some of that work slow for me at
Mm,
times, and can be a little more difficult. So I think that was one main thing. There was a fear. Two was just kind of like, why would I do it? Um,
right.
you know, I when I did start seminary, that was the question I got a lot from my fellow classmates was, well, I want the job that you have someday, and that's why I'm here. So why are you here?
Mm,
Um, and so it became apparent really quickly. I actually met with Dr. Winnig before I started seminary, and he was gracious enough to meet with me at the like student union cafe area at Denver Seminary. And I asked him, I said, should I do this? And I respected him, and he looked at me and he said, "Yeah, you probably should." And I said, "Why?" And he goes, "Because you probably don't know as much as you think you know, and this can help you out." And
mm,
and then he really sold me. Honestly, I know this isn't sexy for a lot of people, but he said this will make you a more efficient minister. Not
mm,
that people are meant to be efficient or anything like that, but what he was talking about was my study of scripture, how to break down passages, and even how to counsel people better with just kind of giving you some more tools that you had. And I was like, okay, I could see how that could be a win. So those
for
were some of
sure.
the main things.
That's great. And so already going in, you kind of had this attitude of like, I probably know more, or I probably know less than I think I do, right?
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
seminary points that out to you. But you also had
Yeah.
this attitude of like, hey, this is going to make me better to love people and serve people, to preach and lead,
Hmm.
because I won't have to be scrambling. It's going to develop kind of this framework for an approach to ministry that could be more well rounded.
Yeah. I also like this is kind of hilarious. I bought the Logos Bible software and I realized I didn't even know how to use it. Like I didn't even know
Sure.
what half the things were that were they were talking about. I was like, well, I just spent a bunch of money on this Bible software. I guess I should like I don't even know how to use a Bible software. What does that say about me? So that was kind of
Sure.
a hilarious thing.
Yeah, that is funny. I had that same experience with logos. Well, I know that going to seminary for you is something you recently finished, and I'm so proud of you for doing that. I got to be your friend in that, and just celebrate what God has done in you. And I know our church has been blessed by you going, and really, I always like to talk about the reality that like for people like you and I, part of the satisfying thing in seminary was that it's not just to serve people and to be better, but like you have kind of a more settledness in your own
Hmm.
leadership. Like, hey, like I know who I am in Christ. I
Yeah.
think that's so important. Um, One thing I did want to talk to you about is in theological education. I think you had one class early on. I don't remember which class you said it was, but a professor got up and he was interacting with a student in class, and
Oh, I
it
know
had
where you're
something to do
going.
with mystery.
Yeah.
And she was like, I think he or she was saying like, it's just a mystery. We really don't know. And your professor said something interesting, and so I wanted you to hear that story from you again.
Yeah, so it was a course that all Denver Seminary students are required to take as one of your first courses. DS 500, Thinking Biblically is what it is. So
Okay.
that's how much impact it had on me.
Yeah.
It's taught by a couple professors, but this one, it's very. This is first semester seminary, right?
Sure.
And they basically said, "Hey, we want to." I don't remember the passage, but it's like basically we want you to break down this passage, and it was kind of a weird, confusing New Testament passage. And so
Sure.
just get in a small group, break it down, tell us what you think it's saying.
Mm.
So each group goes around the room, and luckily I think my group was last, so I got to listen to everybody else and realize I'm not going to talk. I learned that in seminary. The person who wants to speak the first, because I got called. I had a professor one time tell me, said, "Oh, I just thought you were dumb. I didn't know you wanted to be a heretic."
Oh
So I learned
man.
my lesson. I love that stuff. I know some people are like, "What?" But to me, I'm
Yeah.
like, "Yeah, I don't want to be dumb or a heretic, so I'll just listen." But, anyways, yeah. So it comes around, and this poor girl, she used a kind of a Christian answer that you hear people say all the time, right?
Mm,
Which is, "Well, that's too hard of a passage,
mm,
and I don't think we can know what it means. So I'm just going to let it be a mystery, and that's good with me."
mm.
And then she used the word, "So I think this," and so he said, "I'm going to stop you on two things. One, every cult has started with the phrase 'I think.'"
Oh man.
And he goes, "You're a seminarian now. You use orthodox biblical thinking states that." And he said something
Okay.
along those lines. I was like, "Whoa!"
Okay.
And then, and then he goes, "You know what? The truth is this. I've studied this passage specifically in my area my whole life. I
Mm.
have multiple degrees where I've studied this passage, and I have the right to say I don't know what this means. You're just getting started. You haven't put in the work, and you don't have the right yet to say I don't know what this means."
Wow.
And I was just like, "Whoa, this is no joke." So yeah,
Yeah.
that's that story. It was kind of a trip. I felt bad for the girl, but
Sure.
um, at the same time, it was kind of one of those things where it's like, it is what it is. And
Yeah,
so
right. No,
yeah,
that sounds intense. I had some similar experiences, and it can be a really humbling thing. And that's what's ironic about you and I in our seminary experience. I think for a lot of people, when they think about higher education or Christian thought and thinking, is they perceive it to be puffed up. They perceive it to almost be contrary to Scripture sometimes, and that
hmm,
knowledge can puff up or something like that. In fact,
yeah,
I've heard seminaries uh, as referred to as cemeteries for faith where
mm,
people go. And I've definitely seen that. I saw people drop out and kind of walk away. But
hmm,
I know for you, in going to seminary, and I had the similar experience, it actually produced kind of a deeper faith and more humility. How
for
did
sure.
how did going to seminary kind of in your journey and your theological development? How did it produce a greater sense of humility in how you approach theological and biblical topics?
Yeah, it definitely did that work in me in general. I would say it caused me to pause more. I guess that would be it. Instead of just expecting to know what it means, I would say a big thing, and I would attribute a lot of this to Dr. Don Payne at Denver Seminary. But this idea of that we are going to carry our own personal story, our
Mm,
own narrative of the scriptures, and our theological impulses, our beliefs are like they're formed by our culture,
mm,
our surroundings, our stories, and that can be great, and that can also be detrimental.
for sure.
And story's always been a big thing to me because I've had an interesting story leading to becoming a pastor. And I was like, and I wanted to kind of go, man, I think I really need to know the baselines here of where I can operate from. Maybe to put it better is I needed maybe guardrails,
Mm,
right? Because I had experienced early in my faith, I had been what I would call a full blown fundamentalist at one point, where I
mm.
went home from church and all the alcohol that I had to drain it down. Like not my throat, but the drain.
Right, right. Yeah.
Dump it down the drain, and then I had another one where I'm wearing like I went full like kind of what I would call like a liberal version of Christianity, where I was
Mm,
wearing like a coexist shirt
mm.
and teaching. a form of universalism, maybe that's like, I'm like, oh,
Sure.
so I immediately saw this need for some boundaries for orthodoxy, and particularly studying at an institution that doesn't agree all the time with my personal theological beliefs, whether that be Reformed theology, complementarianism, my
Sure.
views on alcohol, whatever,
Right.
things like that.
Mm,
So it kind of gave me some guardrails
mm.
to operate in, but also expanded my thinking about a lot of issues and topics.
For sure, and I think that's really important too because I know you and I think kind of artistically. We're not like, pure artists or anything, but we're kind of creative and we write sermons and all that. And
Hmm.
by having kind of seminary as kind of not only providing guardrails, but almost like um, a garden where it's ready to go. It provides a opportunity for growth, and you're not having to go like prove yourself anymore. You're just kind of
Hmm.
like, oh, like I kind of have a better appreciation because at Denver Seminary, both you and I experienced a wide swath of Protestantism,
Yeah.
and so it makes you go like, "Oh, like, other people see things differently than me," and I think that's super helpful in producing humility.
Yeah. And there's something to be said too about I enjoyed it at times. It should be kind of a battle. Like we should enter a classroom and be prepared to fight, if you will. I
Yeah,
probably wanted that a little bit more than a lot of my classmates or professors at times, but
sure.
as both of us would. But it was kind of I found it to be a safe place to come in and just kind of go, well, honestly, I think that belief is garbage, and I think your theology on that's garbage. Prove me wrong,
Right,
and that makes you better, especially when you get proved wrong.
right, for sure.
I
All of a
remember I
sudden,
did
you have
that
to
with
take a look in the mirror.
Yeah, I did that with sanctification. I thought I
Did
knew
you?
everything there was, and then I took a course with a professor. It's like, actually, here's how you like where your understanding of sanctification is off. And I was just like, and he was completely right. And I was just like, oh,
Right, and all of a sudden, that kinda dissonance that you experience when you, especially with something that we take very seriously, the Bible, and you're going, "Man, if
hmm
I was wrong on that, if I was so sure I was right, but if I was wrong on that, gosh, like, maybe I need to be more humble in the way I approach these theological convictions that I've held so tightly." So I think that's a huge help.
yeah,
One t one thing that, there was a class you took that
hmm
that I think you've articulated, at least to me, that it was the hardest class you took.
oh yeah,
Um, and it was a class on patristics. And so if you're watching now and you want to ask questions, feel free to drop a question because we're going to talk about patristics with Matt. And Matt, why don't you go ahead and tell us what is patristics?
yeah. I don't know. That's how
Yeah.
hard the class was. No, I'm joking. Uh, for just to put it really simply, early church history. How did we develop the theological orthodoxy that we have today
Mm,
through the early church? And
mm,
it's super fascinating. This is where things like I'm assuming most people watching probably know have heard of the Trinity.
mhm,
Well, the Trinity is not explicitly in Scripture. So where did that come from? Well, that came from the patristic era.
mm,
Jesus as the Son of God and all that we kind of modernly understand that to be. Where did that come from? Well, that came from the Christological controversy that arose during the
mm,
patristic era. So these were the men and women, quite frankly, that fought really, really hard to really give us the baseline for understanding Christianity as we know or don't know it, I guess you could say,
yeah, for
because there was
sure.
a lot of craziness that went on in there.
Yeah.
So patristics were just the early church, how it was formed, and really how we got things like the creeds and all
Mm,
of those sorts of things.
mm. So if someone were to ask you about patristics today and why you would spend
Hmm.
time doing that, why do you think the study of patristics how does that affect people's everyday lives today? You're not going to walk
Yeah,
into our favorite uh, taco place, Tiaco, and you're not just going to strike up conversation about patristics, but how does it
correct.
inform how you think about our world?
Well, let me answer that on two levels. One being a Christian perspective, and then let me just give kind of a missiological
Mm,
perspective of understanding it. the Christian perspective is this: is one, I see people all the time want to just say, well, the early church did this, so we should do it this way.
Mm,
And usually that's what they're quoting is the first couple chapters of Acts,
right.
right? And there's a lot more to church history than that, as important and huge as that is. So the classic thing that you'll see, I think we're seeing more happen more and more, especially during this COVID season where churches are kind of locked down in a weird way and all that kind of stuff. And kind of the home church, I'm kind of seeing these people who usually go, the early church was right and we're all wrong. Really kind of, I want to say it appropriately, be very excited because they're like,
Right.
see, it says they were in homes. And I'm like, okay, I get. And so it's being used as an argument for kind of a local church to no longer gather in a facility or building.
Mm,
And
right.
honestly, that's just, it's BS. It's just not an accurate thing. A church can gather that way. That's how we started our church. But to
Right.
say that all of the other forms are wrong would be an inaccurate understanding of what even happened in the early church.
Yeah,
So
for
from
sure.
that perspective, it can give us a more well-rounded understanding of what did early Christians do? What did they think was important?
Mm,
What were the hills to die on?
mm,
And I already mentioned it. In the two main hills that you really see in the patristic area to die on was Christology and the Trinity.
right.
Was understanding those. The gathered church was like an assumed thing. It
For
wasn't
sure.
even a battle. Uh,
Right.
and so it looked different. It was a different time, but we know that in that early era, people were singing songs. They were participating in the Lord's Supper. They were baptizing people. They were
Right.
doing all of these things, and so it really shaped the early church. So that's one side, I would say. I don't
Yeah,
know if
for
you want to add
sure.
anything there.
No, I think that those are great reflections, and it reminds me of something we've talked about in ministry is there's this tension in kind of American evangelicalism because we've been so informed by this revivalistic attitude towards church
Hmm.
for what's next is best.
Hmm.
And we've kind of got to like promote a show and like get a lot of numbers up. I think the first time I had this experience with studying patristics that really kind of rocked my world was when we were talking about baptisms. Um, and there's nothing, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with how we do baptisms, but I remember studying the early church, and what they would do is they would make people go through this long, arduous process in order to get baptized. And I was like,
Yeah,
how could they do that? How could they withhold baptism from somebody? And their point was like, hey, we need to make sure you're a Christian. And I think that could be taken to an extreme that's not good.
for
But it
sure.
really helped me understand how the early church really addressed uh, formation and growing people and discipling people in faith.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And that kind of speaks to the missional posture. I think having a well-rounded understanding of patristics is really seeing how the church grew.
Hmm,
And what were they doing? Well, they were suffering greatly. They were persecuted.
hmm,
They're the patristic era, depending on who you listen to, it extends different time periods, which would go into the area of where Christianity was kind of accepted in the known world or
hmm,
before, but it does encompass all of that, you know,
right.
and to see that the church always had a missional arm to it. It,
Hmm,
it was uniquely evangelistic. And I think it's important to understand that because Judaism inherently is not necessarily evangelistic.
interesting.
It's not designed to be that. So that's a pretty big break to be um, evangelistic in its nature. I'm not saying Judaism, I don't want to get in trouble and say
No, no, no.
Judaism
I know
has
what you're
no
saying.
evangelistic
Right,
point to it, but that wasn't the primary goal.
right,
Whereas Jesus, gives us the Great Commission, and the call to go is very central to the new church.
for sure. Absolutely. Now that class you took on patristics, I think was it Professor Fairbairn? Is that his name?
Yeah, Dr. Donald Fairbairn.
So he's a leading scholar in patristics.
Yeah,
But I think you took a 5-day concentrated class, meaning you went to school like 8 to 5 or something, some crazy
yeah.
schedule for 1 week, right?
It was 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah, eight to
Crazy.
five.
Um, And then he would randomly would he start writing in a different language? What was that like?
Yeah, so he was probably the most brilliant person I've ever been around. Just to note, if you look up his lectures and stuff, they're really great. And actually, his like keynote speaking things are much more approachable than his class was. But
Okay.
and I think that's intentional because he's a smart guy and he understands how to do
Sure.
that. But he's actually deaf as well, and he's a professional at reading lips.
Okay.
And I wouldn't have known that unless another professor told me. Like that's how
Wow.
crazy it was. He would
Sure.
just stare at you intently. I was like, wow, this guy's really connected. What he's doing is
Sure.
he's reading your lips. So that was one level that kind of blew my mind. But the other level that was so crazy was he's fluent in I don't remember how many language, but also not only that, but Greek, Hebrew,
Mhm.
Latin, Aramaic. And so whatever the text we were studying or original, like, and I'm not talking about just biblical text, I'm talking about writings of like Athanasius and people like
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Whatever language they would use, he would write all the notes on the board in that language.
Oh boy.
And he would say stuff like, "You guys know, right?" And there was only 8 of us in the class, and we'd all look at each other and nod, and and we'd be like, "I have no idea what he just wrote up on that board." And then but it made it kind of fun because then people would come back the next day and be like, "Okay, I took pictures of the boards and I put it into my Logos Bible software, and I figured out what that means in Greek,
That
and
is
things like
so
that."
funny.
Oh man, it was a trip. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and you didn't do any languages, so you had
no,
no idea, right?
none. I was like, huh, this is interesting.
Yeah, and
So
I think
yeah,
that goes back to kind of the, humility piece. You know, our part of our job consists of getting up and proclaiming the word of God to people,
hmm
and that carries a lot of weight, and you can kinda think like, "Yeah, I'm the final determiner of the text that I'm preaching
mm,
because I've been entrusted with that authority." Then you get put in a class and you're like, "I know so little about everything." And it
hmm
really produces a humility when you approach the text or approach theological topics, that hopefully refines you into somebody who's more approachable, more receptive,
yeah,
and less prideful of your approach to Scripture.
yeah. Just to piggyback off that, if I can,
Yeah.
just yesterday, I was meeting with a local church planter, and he's like, I've got a man in my church who I do not question his calling to the Lord to be a pastor as he wants to
Mm,
be. He wants to be an elder in our church. I don't question it, but I am concerned about his doctrinal depth, is
mm,
how he put it.
mm.
And he's like, and I'm not sure what to do. And I was like, send him to seminary. And he's like, well, he's a lay guy. I was like, well, does he want to be a pastor? And he's like, yeah. I was like, I don't really think it matters if you're lay or paid at that
Right.
point, And he was like, that sounds like a lot, but I mean, wherever you are, most seminaries now have, like, I know Denver Seminary has a I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's a certificate program for for lay people in the church who want to serve their church more effectively. And it's like
Mm.
5 courses, and you can take it online or you can do it in person. And I'm just like, and he's like, oh man, that's a really good idea. I was like, I sense that tension with us. We've tried to basically write a seminary program
Yeah.
for people we want to train, but I'm just like, just send them. It's not that
I
far of
know,
a
right?
drive, and especially
No,
now, obviously, you can do everything online. You
for
know
sure.
that I was like, that's the I. I'm convinced that it's a worthwhile thing now, much more than I was before I started.
For sure. For sure. Um, Kind of wrapping up this topic of patristics.
Yeah.
If there was anything that you kind of when you study patristics and kind of that in-depth thing that you just wish that the church, when you kind of look at the whether American church or global church, however specific or broad you want to get, what's one thing you kind of wish we would recapture from that patristic era? Whether you're talking about how they dealt with theological controversy or how they were missional, what's one thing you would hope for our churches in our modern era to kind of recapture from that time?
Yeah, I think it would be this. It would be this understanding that I'm thinking of the right word, but that there would be a deep desire to take a hold of what is true and what is right. All the while understanding that your story, your culture are going to play into that. But history, looking back, can inform us going forward. And C.S. Lewis has a great phrase, which he refers to when we look down on everything in the past because it seems simple or they didn't have the technology that we have now. He calls it chronological snobbery,
Right.
right? And I see a lot of that in the church now, where we look back and go, well, we know more now, but I don't know if we do, particularly when it comes to theological matters that matter a lot,
Right.
like Christology, right? Like that still matters.
Right.
And these guys, some of them were killed for fighting for their beliefs,
Right.
and were willing to lay their lives on the line for a deeper understanding of the Trinity. Like what,
Right.
like that's a hard thing for us to imagine.
For
And
sure.
I see a lot of churches, if you take both ditches, you take liberal theology, like off the deep end liberal theology, or you take fundamentalism, what you'll see is a lack of understanding there, in all honesty, right? Um,
Right.
and sadly to say, at least in our context, I would say uh, a lot of the churches that are spread around the West, I think, tend to lean towards, well, why does things like Jesus being the Son of God even really matter all that much,
Right.
right? And that's sad
It's super
because
sad.
we have nothing apart from that, and that's what like if you look at like Gregory or Athanasius or all of these people, there's a lot that happened there that they
Right.
went through to really reveal the truth around this, and they thought it was important enough to spend their whole lives on, and
Mm.
it would be sad if we ignored those realities.
For sure. Yeah, we have such a heritage of deep theological and even philosophical thought in Christianity that we don't pull from, and it could really help
Mm.
us today in how we navigate things. If someone was interested in learning more, just like I know you have several books that you had to read for that class. Is there one book that you were like, hey, like maybe it's not approachable because it's a translation from Latin, but is there one book that you were
Mm.
like, this would be a good example of a patristic era writing or how they thought?
Man, all the books I read are pretty hard to read. There's a book. Maybe you can help me remember it, Chase.
Mm.
I'm sorry, I forgot to grab
You're
one,
good.
but I'm thinking of there's a book that Winnig has everybody read at Denver Seminary about the
Right.
early church.
It's The Rise of Christianity by Rodney
The
Stark, right?
rise, yeah, the Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. I think that's a great start.
For sure.
Um, there's some other great stuff out there as well, but I would honestly, if you're like want to nerd out,
Mm.
man, look up Donald Fairbairn
Okay.
and just some of his lectures.
Yeah.
They're posted online, and you can watch them. And then he recommends books constantly.
Cool.
And even his book on the patristic era is very thick and
Okay.
intense. But if you really want to go deep, just look up Donald Fairbairn's book that he wrote. His seminal work on patristics is available on Amazon and all that stuff too.
That's great. Well, while we're talking about kind of how we can catch up on other people as we kind of transition,
Hmm.
what about you? You've got you recently started a podcast as part of your kind of closing out of your seminary experience. What's the name of that again?
Yeah, don't listen to me with Matt Patrick.
Which is great.
Yeah.
Where can people find that?
It's on Apple Podcasts. I stream it live just like you're doing right now.
Okay.
It's on YouTube.
Okay.
It's on Stitcher. Basically, if you can find a podcast, you can find it, because like I've got like 9 views. You might have to dig a little bit,
Sure.
but yeah, it's great. I bring on people who are experts on things that I am not an expert on,
Right.
and the whole point is, don't listen to me, listen to what they have to say,
That's great.
and it's a good time.
That's awesome, man. Well, thanks for sharing that, and thanks for joining
Yep.
me for kind of my introductory episode.
Yeah, I'm glad I could be zero for you.
Yeah, episode 0, like patient 0.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for who are joining us in the chat. Tim, Travis, Claire, Charles. It was great to have you kind of chime in as we went along. Kind of as we close out, I just wanted to invite you to join me tomorrow. I'm going to be interviewing Dr. David Gustafson from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is TEDS, as most people would call it. up in Chicago. He's the chair of evangelism and missiology there. And we're going to be talking about contextualization. Leslie Newbegin, what can we learn from people that have navigated contentious cultural times that have gone before us that maybe could help us navigate how we have conversations about contentious issues today? So that's going to be tomorrow. So I hope you'll join me for that. And this will be on a podcast. It'll be a YouTube channel coming soon. So keep an eye out for that. And until then, we will see you hopefully tomorrow. Thanks, Matt.
You're welcome, man. Happy to be here.